Okay, so we're recording. I'm Edwin Rutsch, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy and founder of the Empathy Tent. And you want to introduce yourself,
Thank
Lou?
you. My name is Lou Agosta. My claim to fame is I'm the author of 3 books on empathy, academic peer-reviewed, and 1 popular treatment of the subject, Empathy Lessons. It's so great to be here today, Edwin. I always learn a lot and get a lot out of mixing it up with you. I want to begin by acknowledging you and your leadership with the culture of empathy. I think there's a cultural and even political dimension to empathy that you have brought me to an expanded awareness of it. I start out from the empathy consulting one-on-one dimension, but it really does take a community.
Yeah, that's it's that culture of empathy. It's not sort of individualistic empathy, and then sort of a culture of empathy, and sort of those different aspects. So, and I also want to acknowledge, this super prolific writing that you do, and plus you have a website, louagosta.com, right?
I do, Lou Agosta. You can find me, louagosta.com. Also, separately, the blog is Empathy Lessons, www.empathylessons.com.
There's a huge amount of resources, there. So.
I publish, there's a personal site and a kind of quasi-political blog, Empathy Lessons. A lot of things converge. I remember we were talking, this is continuing a conversation. I was being a agent provocateur, saying, if you all, oh dear audience, oh dear individual, are experiencing compassion fatigue, which is sometimes an occupational hazard for helping professions, first responders, many different kinds of professions, consider a radical proposal. If you're experiencing compassion fatigue, maybe consider dialing down your compassion and dialing up your empathy.
You wrote an article called Compassion Fatigue, or Radical Proposal for Overcoming It, and we spent 1 meeting talking about it. We want to sort of follow up on that at other points. And I think it was an important topic, because I find the compassion community, there's kind of these different communities, and as a compassion community, a lot sort of based on Buddhism, kind of has grown out of the Buddhist community, and it's gone into the university. Stanford has the Center for Compassion Altruism Research. Berkeley has that trend. There's University of Wisconsin, I think, and some others who've sort of, yes. And then there's this trend I'm seeing to transfer this term compassion fatigue to empathy fatigue.
Well, I want to say clearly, I honor and acknowledge the Buddhists and the Zen masters, and the world needs both more compassion and expanded empathy. The world is not yet, until we have the problem that the world is overflowing with compassion and empathy, and a short list of closely related things: dignity, respect, altruism, doing good actions and deeds of all kinds. The job is not done. And having said that, compassion and empathy are not the same thing.
Well, I just find that the compassion community, that there's been a sort of a criticism of empathy, and I don't quite get it, because you have books like Against Empathy, The Case for Rational Compassion, and that general trend of, empathy bad, and it's like the compassion community is almost as grudgingly kind of embracing empathy because of all the science, but they sort of want to dismiss it. It seems to be finding ways of dismissing it, I guess this is not that book, but the Paul Bloom book is not the only one. I got a whole list of articles which are, the problem with empathy and compassion is the solution. So
well, it makes me want to say this is a challenge to my empathy, your empathy, our empathy. We now get to be empathic with this individual, Voldemort. No, I mean Paul Bloom. He who was named, I'm sorry, I slipped out. I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, he whose name shall not be mentioned. I mean,
Paul Bloom. I've tried for 5 years to have an empathy circle with him. He won't talk to me. 5 years. His first book came out.
That's a problem.
His first article came out in the New Yorker, right? And it was against it. And the first thing I did was send him an email and say, Paul, great. I'd love to empathize with you about your book, your article being critical of empathy. He says, I don't have time to talk to you. I said, well, will you have time? It's like he didn't respond. It was like, for the rest of my life, I will have no time to talk to you. And I did have an email exchange with him before he wrote his book, but he would never do it publicly in a forum like this, in a recorded forum.
I mean, this is not Dump on Paul Bloom Day. And I just want to say, I mean, you title a book Against Empathy. I think it's a brilliant move. We're going to have a whole series against motherhood, against apple pie. I mean, add compassion and dignity to the list. I mean, it'll move some stock, and I'm still committed to being inclusive and including Paul Bloom on the empathy circle. But I think it behooves us to define our terms, and. In all fairness to all the participants in the vigorous ongoing debate. And you want me to do that, or?
No, I totally agree that about 90% of what we're talking about seems to be differences in definition. So it's like we're kind of talking past each other because we have these words, we have these associations with the words, and then we're like talking about two different things. Like, with Paul Bloom, I just couldn't understand what he was talking about until finally he defined his terms. And his term is if you go to your therapist and you're totally mad, like, oh, I'm so angry, I'm pissed off. And then for him, empathy is the therapist says, oh, I'm so mad, I'm pissed off. So it's sort of the state matching or sympathetic response. And he's calling that empathy. And for me, it's actually like a sympathetic response or a state matching, like I'm saying. And it's actually a block to empathy. So a lot of the criticisms of that state that he is describing, I actually agree with him.
Well, I mean,
but the bigger picture, if I just finish, the bigger picture is that he will not dialogue about it for me, that he's not willing to have a face-to-face recorded public dialogue. I still have problems with that.
Well, so there, Paul Bloom. I mean, we wait to hear from you, sir. I would say that in some ways, the solution or the antidote or the toxin, if you will, to parochialism and narrow-minded ways of being, which are sometimes attributed to empathy. The solution is quite simple: expanded empathy. Mm-hmm. If people are being parochial, the coaching is not, I mean, it's a breakdown of empathy to exclude others. I mean, and human beings are notoriously territorial and lacking in compassion and overly aggressive and alternatively overly sexed and underly sexed and overly aggressive and underly aggressive and bullying and cynical and a difficult species. And one approach is expanded empathy that actually, to use the word fix is not perhaps the best word, but it shifts the problem out of stuckness. And
well, you're responding to like Paul has a criticism. He says empathy is parochial. It's only kind of sort of face to face for the immediate people around you. And you're saying, what I'm hearing is, well, you can expand that. You can expand your empathy for more and more people. And
what I'm saying, it happens a lot. I mean, empathy, having written a couple of books on the subject, you would think I'm a big fan of it, and you would be right. I mean, and full disclosure, empathy has its ways of breaking down, going off the rails, misfiring. Empathy is like, I mean, just because I have a hammer doesn't mean I can necessarily know how to drive in the nail properly. I need carpentry 101. When I first tried to hammer a nail, I bent it. And I had this guy who said, well, no, it's the wrist, Lou. I mean, and you hit it this way, and then it works better. So it takes practice. You might actually argue people are born with a certain measure of empathy, and some have more and some have less, and some are out on the skinny edges of the normal distribution. But we're talking about the average human being. Most of us here are towards in the middle. We've got some, we sometimes succeed, and practice is what makes a difference. It's eminently something that's trainable. And the bottom line being, when you work at it, you get better at it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you got to practice. It takes practice.
Well, I want to call out, we've been given, Professor Bloom way too much airtime here. I want to call out Jamil Zaki, Zaki, Jamil, Jamil, Jam.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's over there in your neighborhood at Stanford.
Mm-hmm.
And this is like some ways a bold statement of the obvious. We now need evidence-based research to prove that if you practice at something, you get better. Well, it's like, I'm an empath, I'm born this way, I can't change. Wait a minute, stop. If you practice, he's demonstrated in evidence-based research that people who are motivated to work at being empathic get better at it. They take ground. I'm paraphrasing now, but that's the gist of it. He's got a solid academic career. The guy's a bit, I'm not real envious, but his star is rising. I'm envious, man. He's doing great work. And so I did read, I wish I had it lying around. Anyway, he's publishing, and it's like,
I gotta give Carl Rogers credit. He had that same statement in the 70s already.
Yeah.
It takes, I don't know if it's with that, but it takes a while to kind of get it out there.
Well, it goes around, and it got it out there, and then it went away, and Professor Zaki is bringing it back, I would say.
Yeah.
So
there's a lot of people working on empathy. You are, I am, Jamil. I mean, there's those are all books on empathy. So there's a lot of people, thinking about it, talking about it, writing about it. So, yeah. And what I was basically hearing is we need to practice it. Like anything, empathy needs to be practiced. And you were going to sort of define the term again, I think.
Oh, thank you. I mean, and so here's the definition: 4 aspects. Be open to the other person's expressions of life, of what they're going through. Usually they're talking, but it's like emotion also. Be open to what the other person is saying. Take that data. That's like data. It's like what they're saying, who they're being, and process it further against who they are as a possibility. If I get stuck, take a walk in their shoes with their shoe size, so I know where their foot pinches, and then give back to them what I got in a form of words. It sounds like, wow, it sounds like you've been dealing with something. It sounds like, take what I get from them. Now, here's where there's a risk is getting lost in translation, which would be another breakdown of empathy, but sometimes it works just fine to use their own words. But I find to really take the game up a level, right? To get out, to re-describe what their experience in words different than they use, which gives them back what that experience is. I mean, and I know, there's nothing wrong with if they say, I feel like shit, man, I get it. You feel like dog poop, right? I mean, you're right. I'm all right.
Yeah,
it's a bad example there, but I mean,
you're talking about the definition as Carl Rogers sort of defined it. It seems in the 50s, 60s, 70s.
Unconditional positive regard.
Well, it's hearing the other person and then being able to reflect back your understanding and sort of getting a check to see if you're accurate there. And that's sort of, it's the core practice within the therapy, right? I mean, I think you're a therapist too, aren't you? You're a psychotherapist. So it's being able to listen to people who, and we do that in our daily lives. You don't have to be a therapist, right? We're kind of
right. Every mother,
present with
every
it's just
mother,
a
every
human,
teacher,
yeah, it's just a
every
human
teacher,
condition. And the therapeutic world has sort of taken this and used it really focused on articulating that practice and exploring it and developing it and practicing it in that healing context. So I just want to give a bit of a context for that.
I mean, I want to say, like you say, every parent knows a lot about empathy. Every teacher, every business person with customers, everybody. I mean, it's almost a definition of humanity here. That and that's what takes us into the whole conversation about a culture of empathy in the community, where we human beings are all related to one another. It's not like I'm some isolated consciousness and then I have to succeed in connecting with you. We're already connected. The myth, if there is a myth, it's that we're unconnected.
Yeah.
And that somehow we have to get reconnected.
So we're already connecting at these levels at a felt experience with others all the time. Every time we see someone, we're sensing how their energy, their feelings. The mother with the baby, if the baby is crying, is able to sense that. If it's happy, it's able to feel.
Very much so.
So it's just the core.
That's a core skill for being a human being. I mean, with the baby is pre-verbal. The baby doesn't have language yet, and it's a great. I take it like the baby teaches the parent to be empathic. The student teaches the teacher to be empathic. The customer, the client or patient, if you will, teaches the therapist to be empathic. He, she, it, the baby makes possible, creates a clearing for empathy to come forth. Without the baby, no parental empathy. Without the customer, no business person can be empathic in the world.
So it's a relationship. I think you're addressing the relationship aspect of it. It's not just you're individually off on your own empathizing. You're kind of you need the person you're empathizing with, and there's a real relationship there. It
creates the clearing. Take it to politics. Without the citizen, the politician doesn't really have a job. The politician comes in a proper sense of the word. I don't mean bad, negative, ugly politics, of which there's no shortage, but in its original founding brothers, sisters sense of the word, the politician comes into existence to serve the citizen. Not everybody can go to Washington, D.C. Even in 1776, it took 5 days to get there through the rain and mud on a horse or stuck in the mud in a carriage. So you send a representative. And so the politician is called forth by the citizen and his need there's a valid function of government to build roads and to provide the fire department and the police department and to defend against foreign enemies, as Jefferson said, to provide for domestic tranquility and to defend against foreign enemies. It's there's a lot of humans can be aggressive. And they can also be incredibly empathic. And the struggle is to find a balance, right? A
balance of what?
A balance of cooperation, of the way I just put it, a balance of aggression and empathy in the community. Empathy doesn't mean I'm a doormat. The world is filled with bullies. I said, thus far and no further. I got real trouble with that language. We'll come back to that.
I remember your book. That was actually one of the pieces that sort of stuck out in your last book, talking about your experience having been bullied. And so the impact that had on you. Well, it was very personal. It was very interesting.
Very much so. Very much so. How does empathy deal with a bully? One way to deal with it, kind of the bad way, is to become a bully oneself. Nobody is required to be a doormat. It doesn't mean being bullied. One has to draw a limit. If necessary, self-defense. It is a little bit like Tai Chi or Jiu-Jitsu, you step aside and the other guy goes flying. You have to use his own or her own energy against him. Now, that's easier said than done. But basically, empathy speaks truth to power to bullies by saying thus far and no further. This is not going to work. This is
I
not
think
going
there's
to
another
fly.
aspect to the bullying is,
Please.
well, I mean, kind of stepping back a little bit, is that's the culture of empathy. You're sort of talking about the relationship. And I think that's the thing I even called my center for building a culture of empathy. In the therapist-client relationship, where a lot of empathy work was done, there's a therapist who's listening to the client, and it's really a one-way empathy, right? That you're listening, they're listening, and that there is a relationship, but it's not mutual. It's like, you know, I do something called the empathy circles, which I think is this mutuality and sort of models in a simple way this mutuality. So everybody is equal in the sense that, you know, the therapist would be listening in that therapeutic model, and then that's sort of it. You know, you get paid for it, and then the person goes. But in a relationship, it's like then the other person gets their turn to share about what's going on in their life, right? And then it's a mutuality. It's a bit like we're doing here. You know, I'm sharing a bit, you're sharing, so we're really in this mutual, equal sort of relationship.
Well, I think that's a nice point. What I would say is, and maybe this is, I acknowledge the value of an empathy circle and the work which you have championed of peer-to-peer listening. Sometimes the thing about therapy or even empathy consulting, somebody is suffering. And it's like, man, you just don't get what I'm going through. And, you know, they try to explain it to father, mother, sister, brother. Parents may get it, may not get it. Friends may get it, may not get it. And they want somebody to talk to who's nobody can be an absolute unconditional listening, but that's the service. I want a good listening. Somebody who really gets me as a possibility. Somebody who's a committed listener. And that's what you're creating in your empathy circle. What does sometimes happen is that people are really dealing with some difficult stuff. They're really suffering. And in the world of, call it what you will, psychological symptoms, psychiatric symptoms, things like anxiety, debilitating anxiety, low mood, people acting out, bad relationships to alcohol, alcohol abuse, bad relationships to intimate partners, spousal abuse, bad relationships, period, bad relationships to oneself, self-abuse, right? People are like, sometimes it takes a little bit more and a little bit, we need the distinction kind of an empathy warrior, somebody not SEAL Team 6, that's a whole different drill, but somebody who's willing to go in and take some flack and kind of take some risks emotionally and interpersonally to try to to help the person shift out of stuckness. You know, I mean, it may be that in a given empathy circle, people may be stuck or unstuck. And, you know, do I really want to? This is what I've been somewhat, just full disclosure, I'll give an example. We're talking about bullying. This is a matter of public record. I publish on this in my book, A Rumor of Empathy, on resistance, narrative, and resistance, narrative, and something or other. I'm going to remember the title of my own book. But, one of the biggest bullies in my life was my father. That's pretty confronting. This man could be a bully. And I suffered, the family suffered. And it's going to be hard to give you the 2-minute version of this. But there came to a point, he just had a bad temper. And he didn't drink. And he was a good provider for the family. And I loved him dearly, which was the problem, because if it had only been hate, it could have, separated and that. But it was mixed, affection and hostility. What a mess. Mm-hmm. And so where's the empathy there, right? I had it that, and part of the reason I got into this whole empathy thing is this was an enormous breakdown of empathy. As a kid, I needed some empathy in the father function. And there were times when it did show up, but there were a lot of times he just plain didn't get it. The way I was behaving was I was bringing home good grades. I was slacking a little on doing my chores. Show me the kid who didn't. it didn't go well, and I had to set a limit. Finally, you get to be 17 years old. Yeah, I hit him back. Full stop. Did a lot of good.
Mm-hmm.
But by that time, that set a boundary, right? I mean, but by that time, the damage was done. And it took a lot of years of my therapy. So, again,
you kind of worked it through therapy yourself.
Yeah. I mean, that's the short version. I send the interested reader to the psychological book, A Rumor of Empathy. What is it? Resistance, narrative, and empathy, I think, something to that.
Yeah, well, I totally understand what you mean. That there's situations where you need sort of a specialist, someone like a physician, right? They got special skills that you need that emergency empathy, right? You got really issues that you can't work out within the community.
Yeah.
So it's good to have therapists who are there for that role. What I'm looking at is a couple things. Is one, like in your family, can we have sort of like, and it scales to the larger political situation, can we have a cultural agreement or a family agreement that we want a culture of empathy in our family, so that there's something to reference? It's sort of like we want, and I do that when I do family conflict mediation. I start off by saying, our intention is to create a culture of empathy in the family, which is for mutual support, for everyone to be heard to their satisfaction, and for us to have a caring, loving, supportive family environment. So we have our intention, and so in your family, if you had that intention, you can kind of say, hey, I'd like to reference our intention here in the family, as well as we have a family practice. We do that in my family. We have these periodic family empathy circles where we get together as a family and we use mutual empathic listening to discuss different family issues. And so scale, I think that's scalable to the political. It's very new, the whole idea, but that's sort of the culture of empathy that I'm like envisioning and working towards. Can we kind of shift and sort of have a constitution, an empathy constitution, where we sort of agree? And so in terms of the bully, the other response to that is some of the bullying, you can just empathize with the person and hear them and what is underneath their violence or whatever, the bullying, and
aggression or hostility.
Aggression, you can kind of get through by hearing what's underneath. Or if you could reference saying, I would like a culture of empathy, are you for that? So you can kind of scale up to the point where you kind of draw the line, and maybe you do have to use some kind of force or what have you.
What I get that the situation is complex and nuanced, and it is a powerful idea that an agreement at the community level to have a culture of empathy and to have a 1 million person march and people hanging out, as you have so powerfully envisioned in our previous conversation, even if only 500,000 people hang out on the Washington Mall and the reflecting pool and the Lincoln Memorial and say, we want a culture of empathy, where the politicians, whatever, on both sides of the aisle or get together and actually listen to one another and are required to stay there and give back. And let's say I'm a Democrat, I'm required to give back to the Republican his or her point of view, such that that person acknowledges, yes, Lou, you got it. That's what I said. You may agree or you probably disagree in this case. And then the Republican has to give back, in this case, this example, say to the Democrat, to the satisfaction of the Democrat, yes, you got it. That's what I'm trying to say. And they have to both stay there, like after school,
right,
upon pain of having their salaries docked or being voted out of office. I mean, throw the bums out is always a good slogan. Throw the bums out, that's actually 4 words, but it's good enough. But admirably concise in the right context. So, I get that. Now, so I think that's a very powerful idea. The thing is, politics is filled with hostility and aggression and people who are enraged about something. And here's the problem. I mean, in some ways, we need a political solution before we have a psychological solution. We need a political diagnosis before we have a psychological diagnosis. What might that look like? Well, this is really, this politician over here is a fascist or a demagogue, is a demagogue. Eric Hoffer, the true believer. I mean, there's a lot of, you know, I remember the Firesign Theater and their slogan, give the people the light and they'll follow it anywhere. A deeply cynical statement, a deeply, deeply cynical statement. And I think ultimately an anti-empathic one, because in empathy, you drive out cynicism and to enable understanding, if not actually affection, at least toleration and acceptance to come forth. How do we create a space of acceptance and toleration in the community is the challenge, because we're sadly lacking in many contexts. Some places it happens, and that's good news. But many times we're missing acceptance and toleration. On this, the day after MLK Day, Martin Luther King Day, being yesterday on the calendar, here in the year 2020.
And the beginning of the impeachment in the Senate.
Well, it's a dynamic environment. I'm really going to try to play it close to the vest. But the message that I got from Dr. King, the power of his message, was to appeal through non-violent disobedience to bad law, to appeal to the conscience of the racist sheriff. That was the letter from a Birmingham jail. He gets arrested for civil disobedience. He gets a couple of weeks in Birmingham. On the state, it wasn't no Hyatt, that's for sure. And he's basically, I mean, he just says a lot of things in that letter. But the power of, and here's the thing, I mean, hear me say, there's not much good to be said about the racist conscience of the racist sheriff in certain places, even today in this country, North and South. Nevertheless, that guy at some point after being attempted to be assassinated, George Wallace got it. He said, I was mistaken. What I was doing is racist. I'd like to clean that up. I'm in favor of integration. And people hated him for that too. I mean, you know, he got it from both directions, which was a clue that he might have been doing something good at that point, which was very late in his career, of course. So, I mean, that's a bit of a rant here, but the bottom line is acceptance and toleration. How do we create a space in which empathy can come forth? And that's your work on conflict resolution. It'd be great to bring it to the family. I'm trying to imagine what I would have said to my father as a 10-year-old. I mean, because it was a basic.
Yeah, you don't have the power.
You know, you see what I mean? It's a difficult situation. I'm not saying it might not have helped. Give it a try. The guy was trying, but he wasn't working that well. I'm sorry, you know.
Well, the culture, if we had a cultural declaration of this is what we want, I think it would filter down.
Well, top down.
Or even if it's it's both ways, up and down and in the middle. But if there is that sort of like the Constitution, and that there's money put into it, like when we do the Capitol Mall, we'll occupy there, we'll demand. But then we'll also demand $10 billion for empathy training.
And get us started, you know.
Yeah, I mean, $10 billion is a drop in the bucket.
It really is. I mean, it really is a drop. It's the defense budget for, you know, 3 days or something. I mean,
for one carrier, not even that. I think the carrier
barely,
is.
The price has gone up. I mean, but anyway, the point is well taken. So it is both a top down, and I think you're right to work bottom up and top down. It's got to be both directions.
Yeah. And in terms of the left and right, like, you know, we go to, with the empathy tent, there's the right wing comes to Berkeley and they say we want free speech. And, you know, and then Berkeley is very, you know, it's just right next to where I live here, is, you know, very liberal. So you have the counter demonstrators, you have groups like Antifa, which is, you know, the black clad, you know, willing to get into the, you know, into fights basically. And then the two are kind of going at it with each other. And we set up the empathy tent, like, you know, right there. And then I go walking on both sides. And I've got my little box with empathy kisses. It's Hershey's Kisses. And then I kind of walk, and I walk, and then it has a little box. I give everyone a Hershey's Kiss, and then there's a little card that says free empathy. Come to the empathy tent for free empathy.
Cool.
And then I try to shake hands, and sometimes I give hugs to people.
Sure.
And I've got video of me kind of doing this. So this is the kind of thing is, you know, we can't demonize. I mean, I get pissed off with people like Paul and stuff, but I also see his humanity and the compassion folks and the left and the right. And we got to see their humanity and then try to, you know, bring them together. So it seems like we need this third force, which is the empathy movement. You know, the ones that are grounded in empathy, are able to listen to the sides, and are, you know, sort of insisting that the sides come together to talk with each other and have the presence of, it's just the empathy itself. Like, I don't think in terms of the policies, you know, gun, I have my opinions, but the important thing is the process, how we're going to relate to each other. And all those issues can sort of be talked through if we agree that we're going to use this empathic space to take the time to dialogue through these issues.
Well, that is so powerful, and I acknowledge you for that. I think that is important work and needs to be scaled up. I mean, you're kind of there at ground zero because free speech cuts both ways. Let's have free speech means acceptance and toleration. I wish to quote Hannah Holborn Gray, former president of the University of Chicago, a bunch of years ago, who said, the purpose, the intention of education is not to make you feel comfortable. The purpose, the intention of education is to get you to think. Full stop. So, you know, how about, like, let's have a dialogue. Let's give some reasons back and forth, and you know, and see where we can get. It's easier said than done, to be sure. But I think we have to keep trying. There's no other choice.
I think we need to insist, so be more assertive.
Thank you.
You know, assertive in our empathy. Like, there's this attitude of, oh, you know, please be empathic. And if you're not empathic, well, it's like, damn it, let's be empathic here. We're going to insist that there's some empathy. And if you don't like it, we're going to empathize with you.
Well, it's a bit paradoxical. I think you
can be assertive, I think.
You've captured I mean, assertive is good. Assertive is good. Aggressive is maybe less good, but it's a rigorous and critical empathy. We have to bring a rigorous and critical empathy to the conversation and say, you think it's all this kumbaya stuff. There's nothing wrong with holding hands and being affectionate and having affinity, but maybe I don't want to hold hands with this Antifa guy. But at least you want to talk to him in civil discourse, in decent, understandable, full sentences about, you know, that don't include a lot of vulgarity, about what is going on and what he's up to and how he feels. I mean, people are enraged when they don't get the empathy they feel they deserve. This is a psychological principle, and you can take this one to the bank. People don't get a short list of things: empathy, dignity, respect, but mainly empathy. I don't get the empathy I deserve. I may not act on it, but it makes people angry, and it makes people very angry.
It's painful because, in a sense, you're not seen, and then you're kind of alone and disconnected, and it's a very painful state.
I'm burdened with this misunderstanding, and that's where a rigorous and critical empathy, like you say, be assertive about empathy. And it's also, you know, what I was kind of alluding to, trying to capture with the set a firm boundary. Just because the words are not agreeable doesn't mean we have to be disrespectful. We have to have respect and be respectful of our boundaries. And
well, with the empathy circle, I say people can say whatever they want. They can say, "Oh, you're a damn asshole," and the person has to reflect. I hear you say I'm a damn asshole, but then you got to be able to take whatever they give you.
I can
right? So there's an equality, and what happens is people they vent those frustrations, and then they start getting past it, and they start seeing each other.
Yeah, well, I wish to say, careful with that. careful with that. Now, if you're on Skype and somebody wants to vent, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's
It
perfect.
can blow up, right? You're
You know,
kind of,
well,
it can
right.
really blow up. Really.
I acknowledge the value of venting, and venting can do a person good. And sometimes venting, here's what I want to say. Sometimes venting is just venting. So what are you really trying to say? That's where we get back to people are using political forums, methods of expressing their suffering. People are, it could be, oftentimes it is personal. It is familial. Sometimes it is political. People are living in poverty. There's issues of social justice. I get it, man. People, I mean, no, you know, I mean, the bumper sticker, right? Which is an edgy one, but no justice, no peace. I mean, it's problematic. It can be confronting and difficult. You know, we're going to sit in the middle of traffic until we get justice, and that's going to disrupt the peace. That's the only thing I'm talking about here, right? But I mean, and then that's civil disobedience, and you get to go and you sit there and you have to take the punishment because you're appealing to the conscience of the perpetrator. And so that's where, I mean, conflict resolution, I do see a lot of, I mean, empathy is integral to the matter of conflict resolution and essential to it. I mean, there's no way around it. But a rigorous and critical empathy starts at home. If I think I'm being empathic, I have to ask, is my empathy, is my so-called empathy for them being very parochial? Am I good at empathizing with my friends? I mean, I'm from Chicago. I'm good at empathizing with the Cubs and Sox, but don't ask me about empathy with the Mets and the Yankees. It's a silly example, but you see it with committed sports fans. Empathy requires being a Cubs fan and being inclusive, including in having good sportsmanship with the Mets and the Yankees. I mean, that's all. I mean, that's kind of basic stuff.
Yeah, well, there's the aspect of the nonviolent action you're talking about, the no peace, no justice, no peace, is I think that the empathy movement needs to go into that area of nonviolent direct action, a la Martin Luther King. As I understand his method, it was like of nonviolence was first you invite whoever you've got a problem with into a dialogue. And usually they're the people in power and they say, you know, we don't need to talk to you. I got the power, you don't have it. I don't need to talk to you, you know.
I hate when that happens, but
yeah,
it does.
it happens all the time.
A lot.
Especially in politics. So
yeah.
And then there was a whole series of steps that you then sort of plan an action. And then so for example, we say to Congress, we want to have a dialogue. We want empathy circles to talk about how to create a more empathic culture. And they're going to say, we don't have time for you. And then we go occupy the Capitol Mall with our empathy tents, and we hold like empathy circles there, and we say we're not leaving. And then they say, well, we're going to arrest you. And then they can arrest you, and then you get arrested, and then you go back the next day when you get out, and you do it again, and you do it again until.
And then you get some allies. It finds empathy does resonate in politics. I mean,
but the demand is only to have that empathic dialogue. It's not that you're bad, you're right or wrong. It's we're all at the table and we're going to have a mutually empathic dialogue to talk about how we're going to move forward. So that's sort of the one thing. It's not sort of a shame and blame, but it's just to have the dialogue.
Well, that's the empathy training. Drive out the shame and blame and give empathy a chance to come forth in a space of acceptance and toleration. And I mean, it's more, as you say, it's more complicated than that because people are surviving their own lives. I mean, there's millions of excuses and many of them are valid, but that doesn't produce the result. Communities that work for everybody who lives there. So, I mean, healthcare that works for people who need help. I mean, what is it that certain politicians have against people going to be able to go see the doctor and not go bankrupt? I mean, it's really challenging.
Yeah, how to get people's
that's my
needs
rant.
addressed.
I'm going to reel that one back in. But so a rigorous and critical empathy. I'm getting on the soapbox about that. When I think I'm starting with me. When I think I'm being empathic, Lou, examine your own empathy. Are you mistaking it for projection, emotional contagion, conformity, something getting lost in translation? Clean up my own act, be an integrity, and then take it, so to speak, up a level, whether on the road or to the mall. Take it to the mall in so many ways, right?
Well, that's where I find that the empathy circle is sort of a practice ground for it.
Yeah.
It's sort of a fallback position. It's like, if you have these conflicts in the family, if we had it as a trait throughout the country, right, that there was support for it from the government for education, that you have family empathy circles, to talk about. So, and that you will be heard, that if you feel like, you're being put down, that your father reflects back, well, I'm hearing you say that you're feeling afraid when I come in there and yell at you. And then you say, for example, and it's like, I feel terrified and I feel put down and then he says, well, I'm having a hard time at work and I don't know where to put all my anger. You say, well, I really hear you're having a hard time at work. You don't know where to put your anger and you've never learned how to sort of manage. Is there more? And then you have it with the other family members.
Yeah, maybe you would get some professional help instead of taking it out on your family.
Then you have support. You have your community that will help support you with doing this empathic dialogue. Your religious institution or community support or whatever. So I see. I don't know how we were with time. I don't want to.
Well, we have. We do have to be on time. We have a full 6 minutes left.
Okay.
Which is adequate to deal with a rigorous and critical empathy. I mean, I think the idea of empathy circles, as I've said, has legs. We're going forward with it. The area in which I personally struggle is how much of my suffering, I mean, I gave an example, do I want to bring to people I know or don't know and risk being disappointed? They get it, but they don't really get it. And, I feel like I've as a matter of, fact, you don't need my resume, but I've done a lot of training and worked on myself a lot. And that's basically what empathy is about, working on oneself. I mean, I think in one of those books, I say something like introspection, self-reflection is the royal road to empathy. Well, wait a minute. Empathy is about relating. So how is introspection the royal road to relating? Well, it's because the other person, the other individual, what the other communication shows up in my experience. It's about listening and developing skills. I'm listening to another person. And oftentimes, I mean, I'm not the only one who does this, but oftentimes I'm listening to my opinion of what the person is saying. That's empathy 101. Distinguish my opinion, whether I agree or disagree. I like it, I don't like it. I know it already, I don't know it already. This is new, this is old, this is in between. Distinguish my opinion from what they're saying so I can really be with what the other person is telling me.
Well, with the empathy circle, the person is, it's just this foundation of practice. You reflect back what you're hearing the person say, and then they say, I feel heard or not. Yeah. And then they say it again. So it's up to them as the speaker to speak until they feel heard to their satisfaction. So you've got sort of that, you're getting an empathic accuracy there, and and then there's the self-introspection. The person who is speaking is sort of empathizing with themselves, and being heard by another person often creates more space in you to go deeper, to share. So, and then there's this sort of this mutuality. So, there's introspection, but introspection in an empathic relationship can be very supportive, I find.
And very powerful, very supportive and powerful. I mean, I have it that people want to be spontaneous. And, we talk about a culture of empathy, which is powerful, and we're working on expanding that. But when you go to Facebook, I'm going to dump on Facebook now. I mean, you can find anything you want on Facebook, good, bad, and in between, but you can also find a culture of everything is fake, right? That's the New Yorker cartoon, and it wasn't about Facebook. On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. and there's this dog sitting at the keyboard. It was funny in its time, right? I mean, we've got people are trying to be authentic or not. Some people are just into being fake. They're getting off on it. And how do I come to the empathy circle, and my commitment is to authenticity, and yet I feel like a fake. Why do I want to say, this is like not the truth, but consider the possibility. But I want somebody, do I really care if somebody knows dad was a bully? I dealt with that like in 4 years of therapy, you know, and then another, whatever. I mean, you know, another 4 years to dealing with it, right? I mean, it just goes on and on. And is it a test? Do I want to test their empathy? What do I really want to put at stake? So what, you know, in this call, what I want to put at stake is expanding empathy in the community and the individual, at being authentic about that, of surfacing the issues, of also of communicating and getting out the word and saying, you know, this is going to take something extra.
So it's sort of like the intention. You like the intention to be clear.
Yeah,
what the intention of the dialogue is.
Well, I think everybody has to say at the start of the circle what they're putting at stake. I mean, or maybe they don't know. It's okay to say, you know, I'm not sure. I'm glad to be here, glad to be alive. You know, let's have. I wish to be in communication, and I'm not sure what I want to be heard about. I do want to be heard. I mean, most of the time. Sometimes people don't want to be heard. You know.
Well, I usually often frame it as you're here to build. Our intention is to build a culture of empathy. So how we can create more empathy, and you know, and you can be heard to your satisfaction. And then there's a whole question of how authentic you want to be. And a lot of times, the more you share and the more you hear yourself reflected, there's sort of a trust kind of gets developed. And as you develop that trust, you're willing to share more, and then it feels kind of good to be able to express. And that takes time.
And to do this in public. I mean, that's the ultimate thrill, to be authentic and to share it and to create community. I mean, it can be, you know, we're running out of time here rapidly, Edwin. I want to say that I think that the work you're doing and your contribution is powerful and over the top. I think we need more of it. I mean, we need both. We need to expand it and we need more of it. So count me in.
Okay, well, it's to be continued. We're running out of time here, but we had one dialogue, you know, and we kind of shifted to this topic, and to be continued. You'll keep the dialogue going. I enjoy it, and it's an exploration, and enjoy the connection, and you know, kind of brothers in our search for.
I agree.
For more empathy.
I think a lot of good feeling, and frankly, I mean, this is only partially humorous here. I'm not only feeling the love, even just as important, I'm feeling the empathy. And that's key.
Yeah, likewise. So, okay, well, I'll let you go, see if I have other stuff.